Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. I'm here in Washington, DC, but I'm very focused on what's been said by one of the rising stars of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. Yes, that's right. They haven't all had a disastrous year. The Prime Minister might have had a rotten election, but north of the border in Scotland, Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Tories, in many ways caught the imagination of the public. And I think very few of us could believe that the Conservatives won 13 seats in Westminster north of the border. In fact, you could argue that without Ruth Davidson's leadership and public appeal, it would have been impossible for Theresa May to put together a government in any way at all. But there are questions as to what kind of Conservative Ruth Davidson is. Because today she's written a piece in the Daily Telegraph about immigration. And she says we have to ask whether the target of tens of thousands a year continues to be the right one. She says we need a rational discussion with the public on the pros and cons of immigration. So, listeners, let's have it. Let's have that rational discussion on what the right numbers for immigration should be, and perhaps whether it reveals a pretty major split in the Conservative Party between the Prime Minister and the leader of the Scottish Tory Party. So let me know what you think. All views, of course, as ever, welcome. If you think we need to have immigration continuing at the current high levels, then call me on 0345 6060 973. If you think no, it needs to be down in the low tens of thousands, we can't go on taking these numbers, then text at 84850. And of course, you can tweet on @LBC using the hashtag FarageOnLBC, and you can say pretty much whatever you want, as long as it's clean. I promise I will read it out. And of course, you can watch us on Facebook here from Washington, DC. And without further ado, I go to Thomas in Abingdon. Thomas, good evening.
Good evening. I don't know whether it's morning or evening. I'm Irish, Nigel. I have a few comments about borders. Your central proposition in all of this was a return to a Europe of sovereign nation states controlled by borders. Now, borders in Europe have given us not only border disputes, but trade disputes, communism, fascism, dictatorships, ethnic cleansing, religious wars, and actual wars back to the Romans. Why do you think borders are such a good idea? Have you not learned anything? Have you learned anything from the lessons of history?
So should we, Thomas, should we abolish all countries, all nations, and all borders across the globe?
I can't answer that question. I am an internationalist, but I can tell you I have learned European history right back to the Romans, and borders have never worked. Veni, vidi, vici has been a lesson right back to the Romans.
Well, empires have never worked, Thomas. We could certainly agree on that. Every attempt to bring Europe under one particular authority has failed and fallen into the dust, often at very great cost. I mean, I suppose, Thomas, I believe this. I believe that good borders, good fences make good neighbours, that people want to live in nations, they want to have an identity, and provided, Thomas, provided those countries, those states are democratic, then it will be a Europe of peace.
Well, the reason that Europe is democratic is because of the adhesion system operated by the EU, which has brought freedom and democracy to all of the countries in Europe which were formerly dictatorships. From Portugal all the way to Poland. These people have been brought to freedom by an adhesion system controlled by the European Union.
So are you arguing that the Soviet Union fell because of the European Commission?
It was never a democracy.
Well, and nor's the European Union. Who voted for Mr. Juncker? Who can remove Mr. Juncker? I mean, the executive body, Thomas, of the European Union are all unelected. So you can call it what you like, but please don't call it democratic.
Juncker is Secretary General at best. He doesn't make any decisions. He makes proposals to a democratically elected Council of the Ministers. Now, I'll just say one other thing while I'm on, if I might.
But hang on. I mean, we're moving off here, Thomas, into a broader debate about Europe. But what about the specific question that I'm asking tonight? You know, the Conservative Party. I mean, let's face it, the Conservative Party in 2010 and in the last two elections have argued that they're going to go for a target of tens of thousands a year. They haven't got anywhere near it, and yet it is still supposed to be their target and something that Brexit will make easier to achieve. Is it desirable to have controlled immigration in the tens of thousands or open-door immigration in the hundreds of thousands?
OK. In Australia, they tried a point system and it didn't work. Now, I will just put this to you to think about it.
Really?
No,
I'm sorry, why didn't it work?
In a single market, listen to me now, in a single market, it's the market itself which exercises control. Every time the government tries to get involved in controlling immigration, it makes a mess of it. You end up with too many accountants and not enough labourers, and I'm an accountant.
Thomas, we're leaving the single market. We're going. We voted to get out. We voted to get out of all of this.
Now, I will speak as an Irishman. I'm old enough to remember the borders in Ireland. If all of this is the consequences of your actions, then I will hold you accountable for the rest of my life. If the troubles start up there again, I reckon you are central.
Oh, hang on.
And you are central to it. You have no answer to the border.
Thomas, this. I do. I do. If you want to listen, Thomas, I'll tell you. Look, I tell you the way.
I've been listening to you on the television for the last 2 years. You are appalling. You don't believe in any sort of freedom
dear. I tell you what, Thomas. Well, if you want to listen, I'll tell you. Right, here's the solution. That given, and particularly for Ireland, you know, for whose agricultural produce they desperately need the UK market, we have a tariff-free agreement and there's no need for a hard border. Common sense all round. Thomas.
Who will be adjudicator of this trade deal?
Look, I tell you what.
Who will be the adjudicator of it?
Well, ultimately, this is central to the renegotiation that the UK government is having in Brussels, and it would make a lot of sense for the Irish government to argue for a tariff-free deal with the United Kingdom, because then there's no need to have border checks. I'm going to move on from Thomas, the High Priest of European Union, to Pauline in Stratford. Pauline, good evening.
Hi, Nigel.
Hi. So, is Ruth Davidson right? Is this target of tens of thousands a year really no good at all? Do we need to recognise that immigration actually is a very good thing?
Oh, I don't know what Ruth Davis is talking about, really. I mean, she can only say that because she lives in Scotland, and Scotland has very low immigration. If she lived in London for a while, she might not be saying that. But I wanted to go back to what the guy was saying who just phoned in, who was really idealist and saying that, you know, borders don't work, borders cause war, borders cause everything bad in the world. Yep. And yet he offers no alternative, because there is no alternative. The alternative is that if you abolish borders, then the whole of Africa is going to move to Europe. The whole of the Middle East is going to move to Europe. And then what? Then Europe fails as a continent. So borders are necessary, whether you like it or not, unless you can come up with a common sense alternative.
Pauline, there are some in the European Union who seem to think that actually the EU is a prototype for a whole world without borders. And I think it's just wholly unrealistic. It's got about as much chance of being successful as Marxist communism did 100 years ago. No, Pauline, I agree with you. I think borders are necessary. But let me ask you, I mean, which Conservative Party is it? Is it the Conservative Party of Theresa May, promising, maybe not delivering, but promising tens of thousands a year? Or is it in reality the Conservative Party of Ruth Davidson? Are Conservatives people who get elected making promises but don't really mean it?
Well, I'm a Conservative Party member as well.
Right.
And I, as a Londoner, I would go for what David Cameron, what Theresa May has always been saying, which is trying to reduce immigration because of what immigration is like in the south, in England, which is ridiculously high. But I spend quite a lot of time in Scotland, and in Scotland, even in their big cities, there's hardly any immigration. And if you go out of the city, there's pretty much no immigration at all. So for Scots, you know, they want more immigration, and I understand that because they have next to none. But for Ruth Davidson,
and Pauline, how would you, as a Tory party member, How would you assess Theresa May's term as Home Secretary for 6 years when she was directly in control of this issue?
Well, it was appalling. I mean, what can I say? It was appalling.
And yet, Pauline, what I can't fathom,
far more conservative.
But what I can't fathom, Pauline, is there are people like you who pay their annual subscriptions. There are millions of people who vote Conservative every single time there's an election to be let down again and again and again.
Well, to be honest, Nigel, in the general election that just took place, I voted Conservative, obviously. But for the one before that, I voted UKIP. And I like to think that my vote helped David Cameron to call this referendum. I was one of those votes that made him realise how many people in the UK are angry with being in the EU. And that was why I voted UKIP.
No, I think you played your part, Pauline. I thank you very much indeed for your call. Nigel, the time for rational discussion about immigration was 50 years ago, says Nick in Cheltenham. Immigration control is needed, and now. I'm 25 and I work in an office of Romaniacs. High rents and clogged trams directly affect the young, says James in Manchester. Right now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, live from Washington DC, where it's 2:15, but it's 7:15 in the UK. So Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives and a rising star in the party, who's had a very good year so far, writes in today's Daily Telegraph, questioning whether the Conservatives' figure of tens of thousands a year for a net migration target is the right one or not. And she says we need to have a rational debate with the public on this subject to go through the pros and cons. So in keeping with that, earlier on, we put in a call from LBC to the Scottish Conservative Party press office. We invited Ruth Davidson onto this programme to have a rational debate. And it was important that we did that, because if you read her article in the Telegraph, she has a direct go at me and a direct go at my campaign posters that I used during the referendum campaign. So I would have thought she would have welcomed this chance to beat my arguments down with open arms. And yet we were told by the Scottish Conservative Party press office that they're not doing any media. Yes, that's right. The person that wants us to have a big, open, public, rational debate is not going to do any media because she doesn't want to have an open, rational debate. So, as she's not here, I'll say what I think about her piece that she's written in the Telegraph. She says it's a matter of public trust that we get immigration right. You bet it is, Ruth Davidson, because the party that you represent in 2010 in the general election, in 2015 in the general election, and in 2017 in this snap general election, in all three manifestos pledged to reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year. 13.5 million people voted for that just a few months ago, and now you want to overturn it without even referring back to them and not being prepared to come on this show and debate with me, someone who you see as being on the wrong side of this argument. And I would say this is pretty poor. I would say, actually, this really does represent a theme that I've been talking about over the course of the last few days, where both in the UK and here in America, people masquerade as Conservatives at election time to get Conservative votes. We heard Pauline before the break, a Tory party member, someone that gives money to the party every year, and yet these fake Conservatives let them down in between elections every single time. And Ruth Davidson, that is exactly what you're doing to 13.5 million Conservative voters. You are treating their views, frankly, with contempt. There we are. I've said it. And Ruth Davidson, if you or your press officers are listening, it's 0345 60 60 973 and the floor will be yours. But for now, we're going to Brian in Tenby in Wales. Brian, good evening.
Yaki da, Nigel, you're a star, mate. I don't know what it means. I think it's how are you, I believe. I mean, before I go on to my main point, the people that shout the loudest for open borders, you'll generally find they've got the biggest walls and they've got triple locks on their doors. So they want open borders for everyone else, But when it comes down to their own security, they make sure they look after themselves.
Yeah, a bit like George Clooney, Brian. George Clooney, who, as you know, was living in London for a bit and was one of the great proponents for, you know, a world without borders and free movement. And now they've decided, the Clooneys, to leave London because they're worried about security. Just about says it all, doesn't it?
Well, it's the same with the most remain areas like Hampstead, St John's Wood. They've got private security people going around the streets keeping the riffraff out. But when it comes down to my area, my hometown of Hayes in Middlesex, we don't get that. Now, the reason Nigel, you're a star, mate. The reason I've really called is, it's because when we voted in the referendum, we voted against the vested interests of the IOD, global banks, and the Law Society. All these people that told us how wrong we were and how shabby we were. We voted against them. Now, all of a sudden, they're all rising. The IOD are telling us that their vested interest is more important than ours. Now, to be honest, mate, I want the workers to be listened to. I want the people that make up the majority of this country to be listened to. I don't care about people in Pall Mall. They don't care about me. I don't care about them. So I don't want to listen to the IOD Brexit or the British Chamber of Commerce Brexit.
But what about the Conservative Party, Brian? What about the Conservative Party?
Mate.
Well, hang on. I mean, they just got 13.5 million people a few weeks ago to vote for them, saying they would reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year. And now one of their most senior figures in the United Kingdom wants to start a debate to overturn it.
Well, Nigel, sir, I stuck with UKIP because we've been through this before. As a grown-up adult, Blue Labour, that's what the Tories are, Blue Labour. They're pandering to globalist corporations that want to rip us apart, take our money, take our wages, pay no tax, and leave us destitute. And
so, Brian, tell me, what do you think the right number for net migration into the United Kingdom should be?
1 in, 1 out.
One in, one out. So a zero net target, yeah?
Yeah, because, listen, mate, we're struggling at doctors, we're struggling at schools, we're struggling with housing, we're struggling on our roads, and only some sort of fascist would not appreciate how we struggle.
Brian, you've made your point very clearly. I thank you. So Brian says it should be 1 in, 1 out. There should be no increase in the UK population through immigration. You tell me whether you think Brian is right or wrong. Paul in Liverpool, good evening. You're the next caller. What do you think?
Well, I think since 1997, 8 million immigrants have come into this country, and we've seen the population soar. And the population is going to continue to soar to over 80 million, even if no more immigrants come in, because the immigrant population is outbreeding the native British population. This is a problem.
Well,
now
that's because most immigrants are young, isn't it?
No, I mean, we've got the Islamic immigration, and Muslims' families have many more children than the native families, and we're seeing our cities be totally transformed. I mean, 20 years ago, London, Birmingham, Manchester looked totally different places. We're losing our national identity. It is a question now, actually, of national survival. People like Ruth Davison, they don't seem to care about our country and our history. They just want to throw our country in the gutter and open us up to this globalist agenda. We don't want any more immigrants at all. We've had far too many. I would actually a lot of the immigrants that have come in and are not contributing to our country, are living on social security and have taken up our social housing, I would prefer if they actually went home.
But, Paul, if people have come to our country legally, you would have to be a banana republic or a fascist state to subsequently take away their rights.
Well, it's a question of national survival. What do we want to be in the future? Do we want to be the Britain that we've been for centuries? Or do we want to be a totally different country in which the British themselves are a minority and feel alienated? We want to preserve our national identity. We need to reinvigorate our nation. This is what leaving the European Union is about. We need to make Britain great again, the way Donald Trump wants to make America great again. We need to have bigger families ourselves if we need more people, and we certainly don't, I think, at the moment. We need to have more children.
Paul, hereafter, you know, once we've got Brexit and everything, you know, maybe we pursue a policy of one in, one out, and no net increase in the population through immigration into Britain. But in terms of those that have come already, and I would agree with you, very large numbers have come over the course of the last 20 years, isn't the answer to try and integrate these people into society as much as we possibly can?
Well, we're hearing messages now from the Islamic community that they don't want to assimilate. They want to be accommodated. They want to remain separate from the rest of our society. They've got a different culture, a different religion, and a lot of us think they're a threat to our national survival. So we don't want that. We don't want that number to be increased.
Paul, you've made some very, very strong, powerful statements there. I thank you for your call, and I go to Yasin in Lewisham. Yasin, good evening.
Hello, hi, good evening. To be honest with you...
How do you respond to, when you hear someone like Paul in Liverpool speaking in such strong terms, how do you respond to that?
To be honest with you, I didn't hear the whole conversation. I was on the phone trying to speak to you, so I was leaving.
Okay.
Okay.
So, I mean, he was basically saying, Yasin, that immigration levels since Blair came to power have been at such a level that large parts of our cities are becoming unrecognisable, and that our way of life is disappearing because of it.
Okay. Number one, I would say something, please don't take it offensive. Your party, it doesn't exist anymore. So there is nothing such UKIP. So it's a failed party. That's number one. Number two...
Hang on. Whoa. You name me a political party that has come into existence, sought votes, taken on the establishment, and totally defeated the establishment as we did in that referendum.
Where is it now?
Oh, it's still there, and believe you me, if Brexit gets betrayed, it'll be back at real strength.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So that's number one. Number one, it's a failed party. I know it's funny, but if you listen to me...
No, it's funny. It's funny because you're so wrong. But go on, make your second point, Yasin.
So it's a failed party. It doesn't exist anymore. Number two...
You said that three times.
Hang on, yeah. Well, number two, you're talking about immigration. If anyone gets sick, it will get treated by an immigrant in A&E or any GP. That's number one. Number two, the whole investors, they come to the UK to invest because of immigration. Hard-working people work very hard, progress in life. Okay?
But surely you've seen there are some hard-working Brits. And, you know, not every single nurse or doctor has a Polish accent, do they?
No. But the majority, the backbone of the NHS, it's immigrants. Can you deny that? Or
no, we have a lot of immigrants working in the National Health Service, and many of them are really, really good. But I do actually think there is an argument, Yasin, that says it might be a good thing if we started training more of our own young people to be nurses and doctors, and not having to rely, in some cases, on taking medical professionals away from countries who perhaps desperately need that treatment even more than we do. Yasin, I would love to go on. I genuinely have run out of time. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, live from Washington DC, where it's 2:30, but it's 7:30 in the UK. So, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, thinks there needs to be a complete rethink about government immigration policy. She questions the target of tens of thousands a year and calls for us to have an open, rational debate on this subject, which is why we invited her onto this show, but apparently she's not doing any media. Well, last night we talked about the lack of clarity that we're getting from the government. And interestingly today, Britain's senior judge, Lord Neuberger, said that he wants more clarity about how UK law will be developed post-Brexit. Will they, in essence, have to comply with the European Court of Justice or not? And it's interesting. I can see why he's saying this, because the government's own repeal bill states that UK courts do not have to pay any heed to decisions of the European Court of Justice after the UK have left the EU, but any court may do so if it considers it appropriate. Perhaps not surprising that Lord Neuberger is asking for a bit more clarity, as indeed were a vast majority of you who were calling in last night. And there's a news flash we've just seen on Sky saying that when the Prime Minister gets back from her holiday, she is going to make some statements about the direction of our renegotiation from the European Union. So calls everywhere for clarity, and apparently the Prime Minister is going to help us with that. We'll look forward to it, discuss it and debate it when she does. And one other story today that really caught my eye was that in terms of broadband and 4G connectivity, the United Kingdom is 31st in the world. That's right. We're the 5th or 6th biggest economy, depending what measure, and yet we're 31st on broadband connectivity. Unbelievably, Romania and Bulgaria, poor countries, net beneficiaries from the European Union, have better connectivity than we do. And I keep hearing the government telling me that one of the reasons that we need to have HS2, which will cost at least 60 billion sterling, but probably double that by the time they've finished, one of the reasons we need it is to make Britain fit for the 21st century. And I would suggest that for an absolutely tiddly fraction of that cost, we can make sure there was proper broadband and 4G connectivity across the United Kingdom. Strikes me as being a rather better priority. So, back to our conversation. Ruth Davidson effectively trying to start a debate to get the government to change its policy. I don't like it because 13.5 million people voted for a target of tens of thousands a year. Whether Theresa May meant it sincerely or not, I think the voters meant it pretty sincerely. And yet Ruth Davidson says we should question all of it. I wonder what Adam in Canterbury makes of this debate. Good evening.
Good evening. Hi. I just wanted to just start off by saying I am normally a Tory voter myself, and I am actually in favour of immigration. The reason being is that I, like yourself, excuse me, I actually have a European wife. So that's why I'm in favour of immigration. So we have that in common.
When you say you're in favour, Adam, when you say you're in favour, does that mean you're in favour of open borders, or you're in favour of immigration as a principle if it's controlled sensibly?
I'm in favour of open borders, I would say. And this comes on to my second question, actually, which wanted to put to you. It's in two parts. First of all, why has no successive government for the last 10 years or so done anything to control non-EU migration when it's been fully within their power to do so? And the second part to my question is why has no politician, neither you nor any Tory or any Labour politician, mentioned about the EU 3-month rule on EU migration? In that if an EU migrant doesn't have a job or the means to support themselves or comprehensive sickness insurance, they can be removed from the country. And that rule, I believe, is applied in Belgium and in Germany, but has not been applied in the UK, even when Theresa May was Home Secretary.
Yeah.
And you have never mentioned that rule once during your campaigning.
Well, first point, non-EU immigration. You're quite right. The government said they would control non-EU migration. It was Theresa May's job as Home Secretary, and she failed spectacularly to do so. Why? Because they simply haven't got the will, in my view, Adam. They talk about these things in order to get votes each time there's an election without, frankly, the slightest intention of ever putting any of this in place at all. As far as your second point's concerned, well, for many years, we weren't really measuring who was coming in and who was going out, so very tough to apply a 3-month rule if you've no idea who's actually come across your borders. In theory, it is something within the EU that can be applied. In practice, it just doesn't really happen.
Does that not imply then that we need immigration? And surely that is the big lie that's being sold to the British people, is that we need immigration.
Adam, you know, it's a funny thing, but I actually find myself, in many ways, in a much softer position than most of the British public on this. I mean, in opinion polling I saw sort of 18 months ago, private polling, about half the population thought that was it. We'd simply had enough. We should have no more population increase at all from immigration. About 50% of the country believe that. I'm tending more towards saying, no, controlled net migration can be a good thing. I take the view, Adam, that, look, from about 1950 until Tony Blair got in, so half a century, net migration into the United Kingdom averaged about 30,000 people a year, and it was a number that we could cope with. It was a number that allowed us to assimilate. So I'm not against all immigration, but I am for controlling it sensibly. And Adam, I'd say this to you on your free movement point. Why I disagree with you on free movement is I think it's a crazy system where you say to unlimited numbers of unskilled people from Europe, you can come, but we're going to make it really tough for skilled people from India or New Zealand to come. And I, Adam, would go for a global approach to this.
Would that be the same India that's now asking for reduced visa controls for a trade deal? Is that the India you're talking about?
But that's a negotiation, isn't it? That's a negotiation. You know, when you go into a trade negotiation, you don't say yes to everything. So, Adam, you know, we're going to agree to disagree a bit on this, but certainly the one point you raise about the government's absolute failure to control non-EU migration when they had the power to do it is a very good one and a very powerful one. On Twitter, I get, if Ruth Davison wanted to have a grown-up debate, she should have taken up your invitation. I get on Twitter, LBC, now an official mouthpiece for UKIP. What? What are you talking about? Whoever you are, shed your anonymity, ring 0345 6060 973, and within reason, you can say what the hell you like to me. Aaron says, can we all address the issue that it's not the masses that have caused this, it's the ones up at the top with power. They are the ones to blame. Nigel, before we decide on immigration levels, should we not firstly check who is here legally and return those who are illegal, as I'm convinced there are a lot of illegals out there, says Ray in Sittingbourne. Well, Ray, it was very interesting. Just a few weeks ago, you know, a former senior figure at the Home Office said that illegal immigration may be running as high as 250,000 people a year. So, you know, you start to put it all together and you realise that actually the sheer numbers of people coming into Britain is something we've never experienced, either in numbers or percentages in our history. Let's go to Zach in Greenwich. Zach, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. You won't find me agreeing with you on a lot, but I do agree with you on this. I'm more of a Corbynista myself.
Right.
I'm
yep.
second generation immigrant. However, I don't understand how people do not understand that mass migration or uncontrolled migration from the European Union, all it does is saturate the labour market. It doesn't saturate the high-skilled labour market. It saturates the low-skilled labour market. And what that does is drive wages down. And then you find people say, oh, well, we need to raise the minimum wage. Why should we need to raise the minimum wage? The free market should be allowed to be a free market. Yeah. So when you have labour and equivalent work out there, then what you find is that labour will be paid accordingly. Because if people can't find the labour, they're going to have to raise the wages in order to attract people. It just doesn't make sense how all these people have a problem. Now, my problem is with all these racists, because my side of the argument now is with all these racists and bigots.
Hang on, but Zach, you know, just because people make arguments about genuinely controlling immigration does not make them racist, does it?
No, it doesn't. But what I'm saying is my argument for, it's like a socialist argument for controlling migration, it's with the racists and bigots. So, for example, on my side of the argument now, I'm having to join with people that say, oh, we should completely stop migration because they're different or xenophobes. But that doesn't take away from my argument, if you understand, and doesn't take away from your argument.
Okay. No, and actually, Zach, what's interesting is, you know, I thought Corbyn was all for completely open global borders, and yet he was on the Andrew Marr programme a couple of weeks ago saying that we didn't want unlimited, unskilled labour coming in from Europe because it was driving down wages. So, I don't know. Do you think, Jeremy, I mean, you're a Corbynista, do you think underneath it all that Corbyn believes in some degree of labour controls?
I think Jeremy Corbyn played an absolute blinder. He was absolutely nuanced in his position because he didn't go completely towards closed borders, nor did he go towards complete open borders. He was right in the middle, just where he should be, because if you look at true socialism, it's about helping the people, and controlling migration helps the people because
it's part of that.
Increase wages.
Brilliant. Zach, I thank you for your call, and it's good to get somebody declared to be left of centre who agrees with a sensible position that migration needs to be controlled. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, live from here in DC. You can listen to us, you can watch us by going to LBC's Facebook page. It's 2:45 here, it's 7:45 in London. So the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, wants us to have a rational, open discussion about the pros and cons of immigration into the United Kingdom. She's questioning the Tory manifesto commitment, the one that 13.5 million people just voted for, to reduce the numbers to tens of thousands. And one of the arguments she's giving is an economic argument. It is that unemployment is relatively low. It is that for economic growth, and it's the same argument you hear from big businesses, for economic growth, we need to keep net migration into the UK at high figures. It is, in my view, bowing to the god of GDP, gross domestic product. As long as our gross domestic product goes up every year, folks, we'll all be happy. Well, will we? It's not surprising that our gross domestic product goes up if there are more people in the country. The thing that matters, if we're looking at economics only, is whether gross domestic product per capita goes up. And I have seen little or no evidence that open-door immigration leads to GDP per capita going up. And you know what? There are some things in life that matter more than just money, like, can you get an appointment with your GP? Do your kids or grandkids have any hope of ever getting on to the housing ladder? This debate, and the reason it was such a pivotal thing in the referendum, it was not about disliking people because of their nationality or their religion or their place of origin on the planet. It wasn't about that. It was about the effect that unprecedented levels of immigration had had on communities and the lives of ordinary people, not to mention their wages too. So, you know, Ruth Davidson can argue that. I myself am unconvinced. Maybe Stephen Romford will tell me I'm completely wrong and that Ruth Davidson has got this right. Steve, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. Nice talking to you. I mean, the one big question is we'll have approximately, I think it's 250,000 people a month it was coming into the country, which I agree with you is far too many people. But out of that 250,000, 170 or 180 of them have nothing to do with Europe whatsoever. They're not European. Yep. Nothing to do. So why don't we be, how is Brexit going to stop them coming in? It's not.
Well, the point about Brexit was that we do have control over non-EU people coming to Britain. It's just that we're pathetically weak and hopeless in dealing with it. The point about Brexit was that the bit that comes from Europe, we have literally no control over whatsoever. So you know, as with all of these things, Brexit doesn't solve the whole thing, but it does at least put the British government back completely in charge of immigration, and maybe at that point the British public will understand that and start voting accordingly.
Yeah, but it's not, because the majority of people that are coming into the country have got nothing to do with Europe. And if you take all the downsides of pulling out of Europe, which there are plenty, there's some pluses as well, but there's lots. I think there's more minuses than there are pluses. And the biggest thing is immigration, which your party has been on about, and a lot of people voted for. In real terms, is not going to make any difference. And if you take the guy who was speaking up in Liverpool, who was basically talking about the majority of, like, let's be honest about the Muslim faith, which is, I think, wrong to do. But if you take the majority of people that come in from Europe, if you look at Polish people, Bulgarian, Italians, unless they speak, you don't actually know that they're any different to English. So what you're actually talking about is the immigration of the non-English-looking people. And the facts are that Europe has English-looking people, as much English-looking people as English people are. It's the 170 or 180,000 a month that's got nothing to do with Europe.
A year, not a month, a year.
Coming, whatever, that comes in is going to be the ones that are people seem to be causing the problem. And all these people seem to be is causing the problem until they go to hospital, and then they don't really care who looks after them.
Steve, I think the point is, what the British public want, and substantial numbers. I mean, you know, we're talking 75% of people believe we should have controlled immigration to the United Kingdom and that the figures should fall. So there's a very big settled majority of people that want this, and yet I think the real problem here, Steve, is that our political class and our parliamentarians don't actually want this, and I think that's what really Ruth Davidson is exposing today, that she has a different point of view to most people that vote Conservative, or indeed most people out there that express a view in this country. Steve, I do understand your point about non-EU. It's been made tonight by several people and made very, very well, but Steve, do you understand why people think numbers going up? I mean, you know, let's say net migration over the last 2 years averaged about 300,000 a year. Yeah. If you add to that, let's say a couple of 100,000 illegals. Yeah. I mean, you know, isn't 500,000 a year simply too much for us to cope with?
The point I'm trying to make is, and I agree with you, the point I'm trying to make is, Brexit is not going to make any difference. All the people that are getting their Calais camps again, they've got nothing to do with Europe. And the majority of them will come into the UK. And once they get into the UK, it'll be even harder to send them back. And once we come out of Europe, it'll be in France's interest to get rid of them to the UK as soon as possible. Because we're no longer part of their club.
And we will have the right to say you can't come in. Steve, Brexit doesn't solve all of it, but it does at least give the British government, once Brexit is complete, total control over this issue, and there'll be no more confusion at general elections about who is actually in charge. Mark says to me, how many, how fast, who? Those three factors decide whether immigration succeeds or fails. Well, Mark, you're right, but how many, how fast, and whom only works if the British government is actually in control of it. Maureen says, why do our leaders do their own thing instead of listening to the people of this country? Maureen, because we put up with it. We've had Conservative Party members tonight on the telephone who pay their subscriptions and yet get let down again and again and again on this subject. I dare say all party members probably feel let down by their leaders at certain times. Ben in Margate. Good evening, Ben.
Good evening, Mr. Farage. How are we doing?
We're doing all right, but I have to say, I do feel that Ruth Davidson is trying to really, frankly, do something that is pretty insulting to most, not all, but most of those 13.5 million Conservative voters.
Well, you know, I'd just like to congratulate you for spending so much time of your life dedicated to removing us from the EU. I do believe at the moment that there are all sorts of plans afoot.
We're on our way, Ben, but we're not there yet, are we?
Well, I wouldn't say that myself. You know, there's so many conflicting stories that I've been looking at, certainly, from certain sources. But on to the subject of immigration, I think people are missing out on the point and the fact of demographics more than anything. You know, the people that we bring in at the moment are actually having children, residing in this country, and our governments and our councils are putting these people first over the likes of our own people in the United Kingdom. Whatever colour, race or creed you may be, of any certain religion, they're putting the likes, the needs of these people over everybody else's, and that's causing some form of unrest, I would say.
Ben, do you see evidence of that in Margate, genuine evidence of that?
I do see evidence of that in Margate. I see evidence when I drive through Canterbury, Ramsgate, Dover, certainly. It's got to the point now where I do believe that the migration should be stopped. As radical as it may sound, we've got too many people in this country already. Our governments are doing, such a fine job that we've got working people going to food banks. Okay, we've got our elderly that are dying each and every year through, heating or eating. It's absolutely ridiculous. We can't get places at our doctors. Our NHS is crumbling. The social infrastructure at this particular moment in time has been absolutely decimated. Okay, we can't afford, and whether or not it's down to the government, we can blame the government, we can blame immigration, we can blame all sorts of things. There's a lot of things we could do to probably stem and stop this and put things right. You know, we're talking about millions of pounds and billions of pounds.
So we've got to get. So Ben, we've got to get a grip. Yeah.
I think so, yeah. I think that all of the people that have lived in this country for the amount of time they have should be put first. You know, it doesn't matter who you are, obviously.
Ben,
I think
Ben, I'm going to have to end it there. Ben. I thank you for your call. I thank you all for your calls. We have had a very, very wide range of opinions this evening on this subject. My view, actually, is quite in the middle. I think immigration can be a good thing, but you have to control it. And I think what Ruth Davidson is trying to do is to overturn the will of most people in her own party. Now, I should still be here tomorrow in DC, where we're going to have a genuine debate about Trump's first 200 days. He's supposed to be on holiday at the moment, but actually, he's tweeting away more than ever. So, 200 days in, Trump, success or failure? That's tomorrow night at 7. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show. Coming up at 10, it's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you very much. Coming up at 9, the Health Hour, GP Dr. Sarah Jarvis is here taking your medical questions.